Who can change your life more, Cormac McCarthy or Jordan Benzo Peterson? And I received a comment the other day that said, also, one more thing. It's funny you considered McCarthy showing you a good life and direction. If anything, his books are bound to throw you into a more existential crisis. His intention was never to uplift you either. So equating him with someone like Jordan Peterson is ridiculous on its face. Very misguided comment and a poor reflection of the host of this channel and his response. All right, Mr. Remnant Writer, I will accept the challenge and show you right now how Cormac McCarthy has more to offer than Jordan Peterson. So a lot of us first heard of Jordan Peterson when he was pushing back against the C-16 bill that was being pushed through the Canadian government. And there's that famous video of him arguing against the protesters on his campus. And it was shocking. In 2017, we hadn't really seen big people like professors at major universities pushing against some of the insanity on the left. And what made it really cool was that Peterson already had a massive library of lectures uploaded to YouTube. And as a Jungian and psychology lover myself, I was very excited about all of his courses and watched most of them and read his first book and Maps of Meaning. And so this isn't a rag on Jordan Peterson session. But I think the CEO of Benzo's lost his way when he got addicted to Benzo's and moved away from his core messaging. And Cormac has never veered from his core messaging. Because yes, if we read McCarthy like a lit bro, you will find nothing that is uplifting or showing us a better way to live life.
Oh my God, and Blood Meridian, bro, and The Road, and No Country for Old Men. I love that movie. There's nothing but darkness and killing. It's all nihilism. But wait, I love nihilism. I love Friedrich Nietzsche.
I love Jordan Benzo Peterson because 6 years ago, all the guys that were like me elevated Jordan Peterson into the god that he is today. And let's get one thing straight, ladies and gentlemen. Long before psychology ever existed, and still to this day, the main modality of transformation is through story. It may be shocking to you guys that love the talking cure and the big pharma cure, but archetypes and the ego and all of psychology had already been figured out in religion and mythology, and of course in poetry and literature. And yes, we are living in a much more complex world now where psychology is very needed, and I love Carl Jung and a lot of the people that Jordan Peterson loves. But let's get one thing straight. Do you think that the purpose of Cormac sitting down and spending sometimes a decade writing one novel was to make us all feel like little sad boys? Do you think Mr. Cormac McCarthy was a sad boy? No, absolutely not, because he was following the program that he lays out within his novels. And I'm sorry to say it, but unless you see that Cormac at 28 years old, when he was talented, sat down and said, you know what? I'm going to create a revivalism of naturalism through postmodernism because I'm a G and I don't care if I'm poor and broke. I'm doing it because it needs to be done. Then you don't understand the depths of personal development within McCarthy, because just that alone, the revivalism of naturalism through postmodernism, the evil neo-Marxist postmodernism was what was absolutely needed during that time. And this was a lineage within literature that created eventually a renaissance in the men's movement that Jordan Peterson will never be able to touch with whatever movement he thinks that he's creating right now. But more on that later. So when we look at Jordan Peterson, I think there are two different sides of him. There is Jordan Peterson, who wrote Maps of Meaning and even his first book and did all those lectures online. And we could say the first 6 to 12 months of his career of fame before he got hooked on those benzos. And then there is the Jordan Peterson of today, because take a tour with me of Jordan Peterson's YouTube channel. It's all politics now. It's all the Bible. There's very little of him developing his strengths, Jungian psychology and the other branches of psychology and thought that he's a part of. And it's okay to be political, but to go totally political and then to cater to your audience with religion and whatnot takes very little brain power. Because when we look back at history, who is still raising our consciousness today? Is it King James I? Do you even know who King James is? Or was it the writer who was living during his reign in England named Shakespeare? What is the adaptation of a Machiavellian philosophy in 2023 going to do to create a positive in the world? Because I know the adaptation of Caravaggio, Michelangelo, or Da Vinci into a modern framework will create massive amounts of growth, and that's why people still travel all around the world to see their paintings today. And yes, there are certain political issues, especially local ones, that may be of major importance. So if you feel the call to focus on those issues, then focus on those issues. But Jordan Peterson is no different than a Tucker Carlson or a Sean Hannity or a Don Lemon, because he is focusing on every issue and just reporting the news with his unique framing on it. Once again, what type of change is that going to create? What type of change is Jordan Peterson going to create by shoving the Bible down our throats again? Because, oh wait, we already tried running that playbook for around 1,500 years. And I get it. I've studied the Bible as literature, and there is a ton of personal growth potential within the Bible and talking about it. But when we look at what Cormac McCarthy has to offer, he is one of the best. And this goes back to the idea of making naturalism postmodernist. And that idea is that nature is a character within the story. And McCarthy gives nature a dim presence within his novel. It really isn't prescient in terms of like foreshadowing things that are going to happen, which is kind of the classical application of setting. But rather, McCarthy transcends mood with nature and makes it a core of the story. He dives in to very early remnants of spiritual ecology and creating a reciprocal relationship with his text, with his writing, with nature, by making nature an unconscious aspect of the story, which is an idea he learned from German idealism, aka Schelling, which we know that he has read. And that's why he quotes Jacob Boehme at the start of Blood Meridian, that we become conscious through nature, that God's unconscious is nature. And through the reflection of nature, God thus becomes conscious. That's some of the ideas that the idealists were throwing around. And I feel that's why McCarthy has inserted nature in his novels so much, because he figured that idea out, as I talked about in my last video about how Cormac McCarthy creates his characters. And the way McCarthy approaches nature is non-hierarchical. He isn't Greta, or he isn't saying exploit this. He is saying experience nature, go in it. You're not going to find happiness. Billy Parham and John Grady Cole are not, as the commenter said, uplifting themselves within nature, but they are experiencing nature, because it is only through our modern projections, which are fueled by psychology, that make us think that we need to be happy all the time. When you look at very early photographs, people weren't smiling. People looked decades older than they were. You see people in their 20s, and you feel and see the experience on their face because of the hardship of life. And a lot of that now has been alleviated. But when you go out in nature and experience the Tao, when you observe and do nothing, nothing happens. But in that nothingness, you get to experience totality. And once you are there, you get to ride into ecstatic zones, or eventually go down and explore the darkness, which once again is the core of psychology. Why do you think every fairy tale, every story, they go out in nature? Why doesn't it all just take place in the city most of the time? Why do all the big transformational stories, even to this day, Cormac McCarthy, Lord of the Rings, even science fiction, they're going off into space to different lands? Why does it all happen in nature? And what makes McCarthy great, once again, is that he's not pushing it on us. He's not saying you need to ground for 20 minutes to restore your serotonin and circadian rhythm every single morning and get 30 minutes of light in your eyes. No, he is having random characters. It's eating like a weird tortilla and beans, and they are out there. And I would contend that if you do that, if you take time away and make a transition in your life, whether it be a massive one, like, moving out and quitting a job and moving to some place where you can experience nature more, or just spending more time in nature in general, without purpose, without ambition, without having to, hey, I have to go hike that peak over there or do this, then your life will be utterly transformed. And when I look at the hierarchy, speaking of hierarchies, Mr. Jordan Benzo Peterson, at the top of the hierarchy for me in terms of personal development and creating massive changes is nature. And Jordan never talks about that. That's something funny. All his videos about politics and whatnot, he never talks about our reciprocal nature with the earth, because that is antithetical to Christianity and to a lot of the aspects of psychology that he believes in. In Genesis 1:26, it reads, "And God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let him have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and all over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth." And until even the 1800s, this old position of the division between us and the earth ruled. The pagans and earth-based spirituality was thrown out of the picture. And this continued until 1800, when a massive poetic revolution happened. And three Germans named Goethe, Novalis, and Hölderlin, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing their names, and they were, for the first time, exploring romanticism at a real level, because Wordsworth and the English romantics, they were caught up in really an extension of the old position. And if you guys want to learn all about this and the revitalization of nature within literature, you have to read this book. It's called News of the Universe by Robert Bly. And there are a couple chapters in this book, and at the start of every chapter, Bly explains the philosophical revolution in each era to attack this old position that nature has no sentience, that animals have no consciousness and whatnot. And he goes through every single era and provides poems and whatnot. And Robert Bly is actually, as I was talking about earlier, the king of the men's movement. He is now dead, but in the 90s, with his mythopoetic movement and his book Iron John and all of his great poetry, he stuck with the game plan. He got political. He would write political books and talk about, the incursions of politically correct culture and how it's destroying literature. But he didn't get lost in the weeds. He wasn't interviewing Benjamin Netanyahu or doing stuff like that. And he was doing it through the guise of art. And in 1968, Robert Bly won the National Book Award for poetry for his book, The Light Around the Body, which is one of the greatest displays to this day of not just political poetry, but applying Jungian principles within poetry. So when it comes to what Jordan Peterson is doing, he's having less of an impact than you think. Because when we branch it all off into hierarchies, and for instance, throw him into personal development authors, because a lot of the information he puts out there is about bettering yourself and whatnot. But as a lover of personal development books and motivation and whatnot, I wouldn't even put Jordan Peterson in my top 100. And knowing how many other authors are out there, he's probably not in the top 500 or 1,000. When we look at Jungians, which I also love and have read hundreds of books by Jungians, Jordan Peterson is not in the top 100 or anywhere close to it. When it comes to politics or speaking truth about politics and trying to get through that whole maze, Jordan Peterson, once again, is not anywhere at the top. But when it comes to stories and creating meaningful pieces of literature, which is the most complex medium of art, in my opinion, Cormac McCarthy is at the top of the list. And so for the past couple minutes, I've been focusing on nature. But when we look at Cormac McCarthy, the contrast to his focus on nature is his focus on science. And if this is what I think, if everyone in the world got into Jordan Peterson, there wouldn't be a massive impact, because probably at this point, hundreds of millions of people have listened to Jordan Peterson, and we're still living in the same world. And all those guys are more polarized. I have met so many Peterson bros that it's laughable to think that he's created a seismic shift in consciousness. But if we all, let's say as a global collective, or at least hundreds of millions of people, developed a meaningful and co-creative or reciprocal relationship with nature, the world would transform. It would look different. People would be acting differently. Next on the list, if people focused on science from the perspective of McCarthy and started to study science, especially in physics and whatnot, but not like super deep, but just pop physics. Because if you guys don't know, I know all of you guys hate Lawrence Krauss out there, and I do too, don't worry. But Lawrence Krauss had 2 books that were edited by Cormac McCarthy, and one of those books got Lawrence Krauss on the Joe Rogan Experience, much like Jordan Peterson. And Krauss shared physics to millions of viewers on the Joe Rogan Experience and his book and his podcast, even though he's insufferable. And if everyone in the world started to contemplate evolutionary biology and physics, the world would look much different because religion wouldn't be as popular. We'd be much more rational in all the best ways and less violence would occur. Even though Lawrence Krauss couldn't calculate that Epstein was a terrible person. And last but not least, Cormac McCarthy and Jordan Peterson are on two sides of the divide because when we look at Jordan Peterson, he loves to talk about expansionism and how overpopulation isn't an issue and how environmentalism isn't an issue. But the core of McCarthy's work is environmentalism. McCarthy has a wound from his father, putting eminent domain on local farm owners and residents of the land around the Knoxville area. And McCarthy is more of a Kaczynskian type of guy. He's at some level very anti-technology and anti-civilization. And from my estimation, applying those principles to your life, understanding that you don't need to have technology, you don't need to be rich, you don't need to necessarily clean your room or have a room, because that's a lie that we've been told. Our consensual reality of civilization and what we need to do has been a massive idea that has almost been cemented as truth now for 99% of people in the world. And when you look at the massive character transformations throughout McCarthy's works, for instance, one of the best is Suttree, because in Cormac McCarthy's Suttree, and there's going to be small spoilers here, but not really, the main character throughout the novel goes through a series of transformations. He tries to transform with a loving relationship. It doesn't help him. He goes off into the woods and starves himself for a while, and it does nothing. But what does it for him is an exploration of the shadow. He gets very sick, and he goes into his thoughts and into his own head and almost dies and has this very spiritual experience, which McCarthy hints at in all of his works, that mimicked McCarthy's own spiritual revolution after leaving his second wife. And also, when he was in the Air Force and whatnot and breaking free from like his original Tennessean roots. That is still the main path for most of us to achieve higher consciousness. Most of us are going to have to transform through a massive amount of pain and effort and have many different false starts before we actually reach a higher level of consciousness. And in McCarthy's Border trilogy, he shows what happens when there is too much trauma. And he has these characters with big hearts, with, big dreams who, go into the negative arc, even though they actually don't deserve it. But all of us, you and I, by applying the three major principles of McCarthy's personal growth system, which is making nature a priority, understanding its unconscious and reciprocal nature with us, and implementing ourselves into that story, which connects to point number 3, which is kind of a more anti-technological and civilizational lens of reality, which, once again, Jordan Peterson never talks about. You'll hear him hint at it, but you can't hint at it while living in Toronto and wearing suits. No offense. You have to walk the walk. And I didn't really explain this earlier, but transformation through nature is non-hierarchical because you go and do it. You go out and find your own path. There is no substance of the natural world out in nature. So eventually your projections, your ideas that you put onto nature fade away unless you get involved in a cult or like mysticism or whatnot. And eventually you're just left with yourself. And then you start to experience the oneness of nature and whatnot. But when you can't apply that same system with the Bible or even a lot of things in general because they have a dominant system. And now with Jordan Peterson's focus on politics, being involved with the Daily Wire, everything that he is doing has now, especially in the second half of his career, is all tinted by his politics. McCarthy's career, because he was reclusive and whatnot, has never been that way. You can read McCarthy's work and not tune into the Right Conscious channel because most people who read McCarthy have no idea about this or the Reading McCarthy podcast, and do with it what you will. McCarthy's not saying and making any really political overtures throughout his work. And McCarthy also explores, last but not least, realities of human nature. And by the contemplation of those realities, it shows us that it doesn't have to be that way forever. That the violence in Blood Meridian, yes, the Mexicans, the white people, and the indigenous people of the Comanches and whatnot, were all violent. And McCarthy really pushes that idea that we're violent by design. But there is hope in his works. There is a massive amount of hope in The Passenger and in Stella Maris. When you hear him talk, he does have hints that we can carry the fire and become better. And that simple messaging, in my opinion, is much more than the hundreds and probably close to 1,000 videos that Jordan Peterson has released.